With that, let's get started. Again, this is a live webinar, Software Supply Chain Security for Dummies, and it is our first formal introduction of a new publication that we here at ReversingLabs put out. Your speakers today are actually two of the main authors of the book. Our colleague Ashley Benj also contributed. She's not here today, unfortunately, but I'm really happy to have with us Charlie Jones, who's the Director of Product Management here at ReversingLabs. Charlie, say hi.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me, Paul. Very excited to chop up one of my favorite topics, which is the ever-evolving ecosystem of software supply chain security. So it's going to be a fun one.
It sure will. Charlie, tell the folks a little bit about what you do here at ReversingLabs.
Yeah, so as Paul said, I am Director of Product Management. I specifically oversee our software supply chain security product, Specter Assure. And actually, previously to ReversingLabs, I was also involved in kind of third-party risk and supply chain security. I ran the supply chain security proposition at PwC in the UK. So worked with various kind of Fortune, FTSE 100 organizations, predominantly in the financial service space, to design and operationalize very large third-party risk programs. So yeah, kind of excited to join the two worlds of software risk and third-party risk altogether.
You've been in the trenches, as they say.
Yes, very much so.
I'm, as I said, the Director of Editorial and Content here. I'm background is in cybersecurity journalism. I published a security ledger, and I've been on board ReversingLabs here for a number of years and help us create our content around software supply chain risk, around threat intelligence, and so on. So really was a pleasure to do this project, which has been a long time in the making, and see it out there, and now get a chance to introduce this book to all of you. So back up one sec. Yeah, so our talk today is more or less gonna follow the outline of the Dummies book itself. We're gonna talk briefly on some of the main themes in the book. First, start off just with an overview of the software supply chain landscape, and then talk about kind of the various chapters that we take on in the book: development, software supply chain security for development teams, third-party risk, as well as actually leveraging threat intelligence to help with identifying software supply chain compromises or risks within your own organization. And then we'll leave with a few tips on how you can get your software supply chain security program stood up or fine-tuned. And of course, we'll take your questions. Next slide. Okay, so why a Dummies book? That is $1 million question. I think our feeling was that software supply chain security is something that a lot of people were talking about, but that really there are many different notions or understandings of what we're talking about when we're talking about software supply chain security. And Dummies book is a great vehicle to kind of lay out a foundation for what we mean by software supply chain security. And Charlie, I'm interested in your thoughts on the sort of value of a Dummies book for a topic as complex as software supply chain security.
I think exactly what you're saying, complexity. I think one of the things that really compelled me to get involved in this project, specifically with you, obviously I love working with you, but was the overall simplicity of the kind of Dummies series brand, especially when, like you said, you attach it or kind of overlay it with such a complex and convoluted topic such as software supply chain security, where you have this huge number of stakeholders involved in the kind of development, the packaging, the delivery of a product or service like software. And even those stages, which sit between the kind of software development and delivery and maintenance life cycles, there are these kind of unique nuances, some of which we'll talk about today, that really need to be understood to effectively kind of manage and govern risk. So at least my whole goal of this book was distill everything I've learned about this topic as we've been ingrained in the industry and business for several years into some very simple principles. And so you can see on the slide here, we set out to answer some kind of foundational questions that any novice that may be looking to learn more about software supply chain can learn about in regards to kind of what it is, why it occurs, and how risk can be effectively managed within it.
Yeah, That's a great summary. And there are other books out there. Cassie Crossley, who we had on our Conversing Labs podcast, just published one with O'Reilly. And there's a growing body of writing and research about this, but there's always a need for a dummies book to just sort of frame the problem for you, give you a good, solid overview of it, and then foster or promote your continued inquiries and reading and so on. That's kind of what this is about. So cool. And next slide. Okay. So I think, the first thing we should do is to talk about what are we really talking about with software supply chain, and what is the state of the software supply chain security landscape right now as we speak in, late 2024. What types of threats and risks are out there that organizations need to be concerned about? So let's dig in.
The fun stuff.
The fun stuff. Yeah, go ahead, Charlie.
I can capture this part.
Yeah.
I thought it would be really helpful to kind of start with a 1,000-foot view of the threat landscape using some slides to help demonstrate it. Of course, that's the previous consultant in me. You can start with that slide. That's fine, Joanna. So I think the biggest thing that jumps out to me when we think about kind of the modern software supply chain and these widespread attacks that we're seeing make it into the headlines of news publications is the breadth of techniques and attack vectors that malicious actors really have to take advantage of. If you break down some of these high-profile breaches on software vendors over the last several years, which everyone's familiar with, SolarWinds, the CodeCov, the Kaseya, the MoveIts, the kind of list goes on and on. Yes, there's an obvious similarity that they're all software supply chain attacks and likely all have the same impact or results at the end of the day, which is downstream customer data compromise. But if you read into them, the initial attack vector in all of them is different. And what that means is that when we retroactively kind of think back and reflect on these attacks and try to learn from them, we really need to challenge the status quo of how things are done. And more specifically, as you can see in the slide, we need to challenge the legacy practices of cyber and enterprise risk management as it relates to application security, which is traditionally handled in things like performing code review, finding issues in source code, scanning code bases for vulnerabilities. These things that every Fortune 500 security function does because it's ingrained in every single control framework that you find across NIST and ISO and PCI and so on. But clearly, these things alone aren't preventing or even kind of making a dent in slowing the speed or impact that attacks are having. And that's because they're overlooking these kind of new material attack vectors that malicious actors are preying on. Things that you can see here, like embedding malicious files in software packages during compilation, essentially after source code review is performed, tampering with software during this distribution or update process, targeting sensitive information like secrets or intellectual property that may have accidentally been left in a software package and never kind of properly sanitized by a developer. We have things like improper hardening of development configurations or default configurations in a package, overlooking basic security risks like memory exploitation. And then finally, introducing behaviors that may seem benign, but ultimately provide some sort of malicious capability, like connecting to a remote IP address, when in reality, it's doing that to set up a connection to exfiltrate data or connect with a command and control server. So all of these techniques, which you can see on the right in red here, kind of form this brand new attack surface, which organizations need to start accommodating to. What does that mean? It means new controls, new development or acquisition processes that properly consider security and properly consider these new risks or threats. So my last thought here is kind of it. At the end of the day, it reminds me of kind of that old adage: fool me once, shame on you; fool me twice, shame on me. I strongly believe that the organizations that are going to be successful in mitigating this threat are the ones that are willing to learn from their own mistakes, or better yet, the mistakes of others, and are willing to shift away from these kind of antiquated practices that previously made up legacy AppSec and better capture these new material risks that we're seeing. Anything on this, Paul, before we move on and talk about personas?
No, I mean, I think you make a really important point that I think is critical for folks to understand when they're, addressing this software supply chain risk problem, which is we've been talking about code security and application security and improving the quality and integrity of developed code for decades. That doesn't necessarily encompass all the threats and risks that you need to understand both as a software producer and software consumer. So this new conversation that we're having is really much broader in scope and encompasses a lot of other issues.
And I think that's a good transition actually to the next slide,
Yep.
which is you may be asking yourself who's responsible for managing this new attack surface? Well, broadly, when we speak about kind of entities that are regulated or entities that have obligations to enforce security within the software supply chain, we like to focus on two main stakeholder groups. Publishers of software on the left, those are organizations who kind of develop and sell software. If you think about the Microsofts, the Adobes, the Oracles of the world. And on the right, you have enterprise software buyers. That's essentially everyone else, those organizations that procure and deploy software to operate any aspect of their business. Now, in reality, yes, of course, there are other stakeholders involved in the broader ecosystem. You have everyone from open source maintainers to resellers or distributors. But for kind of simplicity purposes, going along with the brand of the Dummies book, when we talk about software supply chain security in the context of enterprise risk management, we try to simplify this for our readers. Now, these two stakeholder groups, as you can imagine, have very distinct processes. So on the left, you have the publisher that's very focused on securing the SDLC. On the right, you have the buyer who's focused on validating trust of that software that they're procuring through its consumption and use lifecycle. And you can think of this line down the middle of sort of this trust boundary that was once inherent between the two parties. We almost have to remind ourselves that people historically kind of trusted the software that they used and trusted the software that they bought. That's traditionally no longer the case now after these high-profile attacks. But that was for a number of reasons, right? First, it wasn't actively being targeted and exploited at a global scale as it is now by kind of these nation-state powerhouses or cyber criminal groups. But second, you kind of had to trust your vendor. Either organizations didn't have contractual rights to oversee their software vendors that are upstream of them, or they didn't have the technology to evaluate it before they bought it or before they updated it. Now, luckily, a lot has changed now, and that's really why we wrote the book and put a main focus on one of the chapters in this book of how do you overcome these obstacles that once existed between these two parties and how they transparently share information amongst one another to make sure that the ultimate software package that's being delivered and being consumed is safe at the end of the day.
So
Paul, go ahead.
yeah. So we just, in keeping with this, the theme of what we're talking about here, we just threw up a quick poll for our attendees. Are you a software producer and consumer? And I think the results of that, which I'll share with you right now, I think reveal the reality of, our modern workplace, our modern economy. 8% were just software producers, 25% end user organization. That makes sense. 50% both. And I think that is a really important point, which is the norm these days in some way is many, if not most companies out there are both producing software and of course, consuming it, running it on their internal systems. It's what makes their company run. But are also in the process of developing and releasing their own code, whether it's for internal use or, selling it to others. And I think these results kind of reflect that. Yeah. Thoughts, Charlie?
No, I completely agreed with you. I think
Yeah.
especially when you think about a software publisher or producer, it doesn't need to be in the traditional sense that you're selling software. That's traditionally who we think about, but to your point, you may be a large financial institution that decides to build it rather than buy it. You're still inherently going to run on some sort of software for I don't know, payroll or messaging or email, whatever it may be. But you may decide to build software that you only release for internal use, and you're not selling it or making it available to the wider public or customers in that sense. So I
Yeah.
think that is the trend we're seeing, as most organizations are both these days.
And there's a lot that follows from that, which we'll get to later, around internal processes and, moving out of this kind of siloed approach to, well, development, security. Those are two different things. Like, those old kind of structures, I think, in some ways impede addressing software supply chain risks and need to be rethought. But, you know, stepping back from what Charlie said, just taking a look at, is this problem a growing problem? Is this a trend where the trend lines are pointing up? I think the answer is yes, and those trend lines look very hockey stick like. Gartner reported 742% increase in software supply chain attacks, and 200% increase for organizations impacted by them, and the cost of recovering from those software supply chain attacks. And we here at ReversingLabs observed, and this is in our most recent, in last year's State of Software Supply Chain Security 2024 report, saw a 1,300% increase going back to 2020 in software supply chain security threats. So this is malicious packages that we discovered on open source repositories like NPM, Python Package Index, and so on. Some other interesting data points here, vast majority of companies are reassessing their software supply chain security strategy. I think that's also Gartner data, and seeing an increase in supply chain attacks stemming from one or more of their vendors. So, I mean, I think all the trend lines here are kind of pointing up in terms of the existence of malicious threats in open source repositories, as well as we'll talk about in commercial code, closed source, as well as impact on organizations, cost to them, and so on. So
I think there's actually a really interesting parallel and correlation between some of these as well. The two on the right, I actually really like. The one you talked about, obviously 1,300%, an absurdly high number of increase of threats. And this is specifically talking about those malicious packages that are circulating in open source package repositories, as you mentioned, for the last 3 or 4 years. But we also see this almost kind of 70% increase in attacks originating from software vendors. And you wouldn't normally correlate those. One's talking about open source ecosystem, one's talking about commercial software vendors. But you have to think that the large majority of commercial software packages are actually made up of open source software.
yes.
Synopsys does this really interesting data report every year. It's called their OSRA. It's like their open source state of security. I'm forgetting what it stands for. But that's one of the things that they found is roughly 75% of a commercial package is open source. And so unsurprisingly, when you buy a commercial package, it's bundled together. So it's just important to remember that if you're buying commercial software from even very well-known, reputable software vendors, you are still susceptible to this explosion of threats that we're seeing in the open source ecosystem. So I think they're all moving in the same direction. It's just worth noting that I think they're all moving in the same direction for very similar reasons, even though they're affecting what seem to be separate ecosystems when they're all connected.
Right. And I think something like that open source code was found at something like 99% of all the software applications that they looked at. So 75%, it actually is of the code base is open source in origin. If you look across hundreds of thousands of applications, you're going to find open source in almost all of them. And I think the other thing we've seen is that this is a topic that is getting more attention and more recognition from the industry. And just I'll drop the data point on that, which is Verizon's Data Breach Investigations Report, which is, as you know, is a sort of kind of this staple report, pillar report for the information security industry. This year included software supply chain risks as part of their analysis, and in fact used data from ReversingLabs to help inform that report. Um, what does this look like practically for an organization? Like, what is the impact? Go to the next slide. ReversingLabs has written about this quite a bit when we discover open source threats. We've written up that research. We've also done some really interesting analysis on commercial software. And an example that you should check out if you haven't already is our analysis of the 3CX hack from March 2023. If you don't remember, 3CX desktop app was a VoIP, voice over IP desktop client that was pushed out to 3CX's customer base, tens of thousands of companies. And it was a compromised software update. It initially set off EDR systems like SentinelOne that were saying this is malware. And initially, the company kind of pushed back on that because there actually is a little bit of a history of VoIP applications kind of triggering EDR and endpoint security platforms, false positives. That was the initial take on it. Oh, this is a false positive. But as they look deeper, they realize actually, no, there is, a backdoor within this update, this desktop app update with malicious functionality in it. And ReversingLabs researchers did an analysis on that. And we found basically RCN4 encrypted shellcode appended to one of the files in the 3CX desktop app in a way that did not alter the signature of the file. And then another open source package, part of this Electron platform, had been modified to actually call that code. And that was really easy to see. If you looked at the version of the 3CX desktop app that went out just prior and then post-compromise, you saw these clear changes that didn't really line up with any feature changes or notification from the company. But this is something that most companies don't do and don't have the capability to do, and therefore are vulnerable to, tampering and modifications in, opaque black box software binaries like desktop VoIP applications that are getting pushed out to your network all the time. So this is, we know from post-incident analysis what was the purpose of this campaign. It appears to be potentially nation-state backed, possible links to North Korea. They were seemed to want to target 3CX customers who are in the crypto industry for access to their sensitive network and so on. But this is, this is still the exception rather than the rule in terms of supply chain threats. Most of the stuff is low-level open source package compromises, but this type of attack is becoming more common, and it poses a real risk to organizations. Charlie.
And yeah, just to add to that, I mean, just linking it back to the conversation we were just having, the initial breach of 3CX actually occurred because an employee had, without permission, downloaded a malicious third-party software package that wasn't relevant to their job role, that also had a backdoor embedded within it. So it's just a reminder that, once again, I think a lot of people look at this and think, oh, maybe this type of cascading attack, it looks like a failure by a publisher to kind of secure their software development lifecycle process. But it's just to remind you that software developers should also be deploying robust controls over acquisition of software, deployment, maintenance, ongoing monitoring of the commercial
remote
software
access,
within their business. 100%. All those steps that make up that life cycle we just talked about. And if they're able to put in those preventative controls upstream, you can stop some of these downstream software supply chain attacks from either occurring or having the impact or blast radius that they would have. So once again, just thinking, even if you're a developer of software, you're likely a consumer of software as well.
Right. And some of the rough outlines of these attacks might look very similar to other types of enterprise attacks, right? Like, okay, we got an account takeover via, somebody on their home PC, and we're using, that account takeover. We're doing privilege escalation to get more access. We're moving laterally. All that stuff looks pretty similar. What is not similar is the downstream impact of that, because when you have a software supply chain compromise, your victim list is as big as the user base of that software. And you have a very high chance of getting your malware in those sensitive environments because it's being shipped in the form of a signed software update from a trusted software supplier. So that part of the scenario looks very different from a traditional attack. Okay, next. Okay, so what does it mean for development organizations to kind of embrace this software supply chain security problem, this elephant in the living room, if you will? One of our executives, Sasha Zeller, makes a really good point. If you go on to the next slide, really good analogy. And there are so many great analogies in software supply chain security between this and other industries. Automotive is a great one. And Sasha's point or statement is, there's a reason that they crash the whole car when they're testing automobile safety, right? And not just discrete components of the car, which is, of course, what is the point of the safety testing? The safety testing is what is going to happen in a worst case scenario when we have a head-on collision or some other incident in a real world setting. How are all these safety features going to interact in a way that either protects the passenger and driver or doesn't? And a very similar concept applies in the software security space. If we go on to the next slide. What do we mean by the whole car in software, right? And I think, as we talked about, what is the mix of proprietary open source, code that internally developed code that is in your vehicle, your software vehicle, right? So we already, as Charlie said, 77% of all the code in commercial code bases is open source. But that leaves a significant percentage of proprietary, internally developed code and licensed third-party code. And so, you need to understand the risk posed by those various software components, both the proprietary, commercial, open source, and all the different software artifacts that may be opaque for you. You may not be able to scan and analyze those in the way that you can open source software. And as an industry, I think when we talk about software risk, and Charlie, I mentioned your thoughts on this, we're very focused on CVEs and on exploitable vulnerabilities. But I think in the context of software supply chain security, the problem or the concerns are much broader than just exploitable CVEs. If you go on to the next slide, I think a really good example of this recently is the analysis that the firm Eclipsium did on PulseSecure VPN. So this is in the wake of two separate nation-state campaigns, I think both by the Chinese nation-state actor APT, Volt Typhoon, targeting Ivanti PulseSecure VPN appliances, virtual appliances that secure, obviously they're VPN appliances, they secure many sensitive environments, financial services, healthcare, government. And we saw two successive campaigns targeting these devices, most recently in 2024. I think before that it was 2021 or 2022, that gave the Chinese actor Volt Typhoon access to some very sensitive environments. In both cases, it was subsequently revealed that there were critical remotely exploitable vulnerabilities in these, known as well as 0 days. So previously known and identified as well as previously unknown. And then following the second campaign, the company Eclipsium, which is kind of like ReversingLabs, but for embedded devices, virtual appliances and stuff, did an analysis in which they actually unpacked the PulseSecure firmware, which is encrypted by the company. So it is not something that's easy or simple to unpack. And what they found was a whole host of problems. First of all, it was running a old version of CentOS, version 6.4, that had been end-of-lifed in 2020. So it had been end-of-life for 4 years. It was running Linux kernel 2.6.32, which was end-of-lifed in 2016. It was running a version of OpenSSL from 2017, so 7 or 8 years old, and it contained a lot of outdated libraries and exploitable vulnerabilities. This is a type of, if you're a customer and end user of this device, this is all highly relevant to you to understanding what the risk posture of this particular security appliance is and where you might, whether you might want to or not want to deploy it before these issues are addressed. And so that is a type of visibility that organizations need, and it's a type of visibility that development teams need to be mindful is going to be increasingly demanded of their customers. Charlie.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting conversation. I always go back to I'm the foundations of my professional career start as an auditor. So I always think about like some basic audit principles like completeness and accuracy, and understanding those to help your business make a decision as to whether you can trust something or not. And when we talk about kind of the last slide around what's in a software package, open source, custom developed, commercial third-party components, and then these artifacts, right? All these other files, device drivers, installation packages that exist within a package. It's very hard to make a decision as to whether you can trust a software package, whether you can have confidence and assurance that you're shipping a software package that is rid of known malware or critical severity vulnerabilities with these types of remote access that you were just talking about in that example, or secrets that are exposed without actually having complete visibility. And I think traditionally the people haven't had that sort of access, right? The traditional method of doing this is using software composition analysis, SCA tools,
Yeah.
which really only tell you open source software, right? Because it's basing its view on building a software bill of materials based on what we call a developer or package manifest, which tells you what developers declared to be in a package rather than the components of what's in the final artifact. So it goes back to this kind of this concept of crash testing, right? Like if you're an auditor, would you be comfortable telling the regulator that you know what's in 75% of the package and not the other 25? Would you crash test a car without the back half of the car? No, you want to make sure that you're testing the actual complete product as it's going to be shipped and as it's going to be consumed. And there's now actually emerging kind of best practice guidance from ESF, the Enduring Security Framework, which is a set of kind of 3 federal government agencies, CISA, NSA, and ODNI, which have these sort of principles in them for both developers and consumers. So they introduce this concept of final package validation, which essentially says you need to test the package in its final state before you ship it. But it also talks about, for the consumer, making sure you are evaluating and making a decision on whether you trust a software package, making sure it's the exact software package that you're actually going to deploy, and you're not evaluating it based on an SBOM that a vendor provides you. So a lot of interesting concepts in here, but I like to boil it down to completeness, understanding what's in the software that you ship or that you buy, and then making a risk-based decision on whether any of those, I'll call them components or artifacts that make up that package, whether they pose risk to you or whether you're comfortable with that risk.
Right. And I think as a software producer, as a development organization, I think one of the key ideas, and certainly this is an idea that's in the book, is, you can't go forward assuming that the status quo for the last 30 years is what is going to be the status quo going forward, right? And the status quo for the last 30 years is, as a software producer, there was basically no real scrutiny about, what you put in your code, how secure it was. The threat landscape was more based on kind of perimeter attacks and, malicious email attachments and stuff like that. That's all changed. As you said, there's increased intention and scrutiny and emphasis on supply chain risk and on software quality and integrity, both from federal government as well as within industries, as well as on the part of consumers. And you're going to have to be answerable to that. So the days of sort of whatever you want to put in the sausage, like no one's going to ask, those are coming to an end. I should remind the audience, we are taking questions. So use a Q&A feature on Zoom. And if you got questions or complaints or issues, just use that and we'll be happy to, Charlie and I'll be happy to get them. Moving apart from the sort of, specific focus on developers, third-party commercial software risks. This is kind of again, part of the overall problem or challenge around software supply chain security. And Charlie, this is one of your areas of expertise, so talk to us about that.
Yeah, if your complaint that you're going to post is that I'm talking too much about third-party security, you're in trouble because this next section is what I love. So I think Paul said it right. We talked about kind of AppSec tooling on the dev side already and how that kind of is often or has traditionally been very focused on source code. Well, we have a slightly different challenge on the consumer side where you have no access to source because it's considered intellectual property and it's contractually protected as such by a publisher of software. And so within the book, we look at kind of where existing solutions that are available to a buyer of software because they don't require source are really falling short in detecting and preventing these software supply chain attacks that are occurring every day. So for example, I'll go through a few of these. The notorious kind of vendor security questionnaire that no one wants to receive in their inbox. I've filled out many before, but are inherently, unfortunately, a part of the way businesses run. They ultimately rely on taking the vendor for their word, letting them tell you how secure they are, and are largely kind of a manual and very inefficient effort. You have things like security rating services, which provide insights into a vendor's kind of external facing infrastructure, but really no details on the software package that you consume and that you procure at the end of the day itself. You have SBOMs we talked about. SBOMs can be very helpful, but they're only a list of ingredients, right? They tell you what's in your software, not necessarily whether it presents risk to your business. So it only takes you part of the way and still leaves that gap. Then you have things like penetration testing, which are often very targeted at specific kind of security outcomes, but are very difficult to scale across a commercial software state because of cost, right? Very large enterprises that we talk to regularly have tens of thousands of commercial software packages that they rely on to run their business. And then finally, you have sandboxes, which can be kind of very resource intensive and costly, and once again, very difficult to scale. And sometimes we'll see malware varieties actually be crafted and designed specifically to evade this type of sandbox detection, like in the case of SolarWinds and the Sunburst malware that had this time delay execution. So essentially, don't show your malicious tendencies until 10 days after you're executed. So it doesn't necessarily stop these more types of modern attacks. And so at the end of the day, these kind of gaps in security assurance coverage and kind of spend inefficiency, I'll call it, in these solutions really result in what draws people to our product at ReversingLabs, because our solution was built with this kind of modern software supply chain risk and these attack vectors and techniques in mind. So it can evaluate very large commercial software binaries in an incredibly efficient and resource efficient manner. And it covers kind of the broader gaps in the attack surface that we know modern software packages are susceptible to, that whole new kind of commercial attacks or material attack surface that we talked about before, beyond just vulnerabilities. I think that's it really on third-party risk. I'll stop because I could talk for much longer about it, talk your ear off. There is a lot of really good stuff in the book itself, so I encourage you to go read it. And if you do have any follow-up questions, I'd be clearly more than glad to talk to you about it offline.
There's a whole chapter on managing third-party risk in software supply chain, and yet very, very detailed. So definitely worth checking out. So the last substantive chapter of the, well, not substantive, the last kind of non-top 10 chapter of the book is on using threat intelligence to look for threats, look for risks within your software supply chain. ReversingLabs obviously is the long history, and we'll talk about it shortly, just in threat intelligence, malware reverse engineering, and it's sort of our superpower, our secret sauce of what we bring to the software supply chain security conversation, which is this focus on behaviors, malicious behaviors and indicators of compromise that increasingly, have been used for a long time in terms of incident response and threat hunting within organizations that have been compromised by malicious actors, right? So we talk about atomic indicators, pieces of threat intelligence, hash values for specific files or so on that you can use to just look across your network and see, is there any evidence that I've got a malicious actor here somewhere in my environment? There's also just the tactics, techniques, and procedures. Do they, use PowerShell, live off the land? How do they move laterally? What types of, this actor is targeting, um, you know, uh, Active Directory or uses Mimikatz or, all the sort of various tactics, techniques, and procedures. They come at you from a phishing attack or they come at you this way. Um, in the context, this is all really relevant in terms of threat hunting, but it's increasingly relevant for organizations that are hoping to spot and deflect software supply chain compromises, both again on the software producer side, critically, as well as on the software consumer side. What does it mean, though, in the context of supply chain risk? I think in many ways, the SolarWinds compromise that Charlie mentioned is a great example of this. And ReversingLabs was actually very involved in that incident after the attack in helping to analyze the SolarWinds Orion binary and help determine where the compromise actually happened in that very massive binary, what particular files were manipulated, altered between the last known good version and the malicious version, and used to implant a backdoor on the Ryan customers' networks. In the context of using threat intelligence for supply chain risks, it's in many ways sort of a similar approach in that, again, we're looking for known indicators of compromise or tactic, techniques, and procedures. It's just that they're happening in the context of software development or software, compilation and distribution. So some of the things, like with SolarWinds, scanning finally produced packages, the binaries, before you ship them off to your customers. This is true in the case of 3CX2, to look for unexplained variations and differences, right? And then finding those, you can walk back, okay, this is what we're seeing. Does this line up? Does this correlate with other incidents that have happened in the past or malicious campaigns that we've identified? And if so, who or what was behind those, right? Is this something that's a false flag that we can ignore and go ahead and ship out our product? Or is this something that says, oh, hold on, we want to hold off on this release and dig deeper because this looks like an IOC from this campaign or this actor? It's the same process. It's the same approach. The other, source of threats and area that you need to be focused on is, in 3CX and SolarWinds, we had, commercial code. There's obviously a very active environment of malicious activity and compromises and campaigns going on within open source repositories, again, NPM, Python package index, and so on, designed to infiltrate legitimate development projects, legitimate applications with malicious code, typo squatting and things like that. Really common techniques to just fool busy, harried developers who fat finger some name and accidentally end up importing, a malicious backdoor in what they thought was a legitimate, open source project. But being able to leverage threat intelligence to kind of inform those types of investigations is critical, because otherwise, who's to tell what is a false flag, false positive, and what is a legitimate red flag that you should be, putting on the brakes and getting your team together to start digging deeper. Charlie, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think you captured it well. I think I'd say the only other thing I'd bring up is it's a continuous process, right? It's not, the more and more we test software, and even I internally mess around with our product and test commercial and custom developed packages, you realize that it may not always be the first time that you find something, right? That's going to be this blinking red light that's like, this is known to be malicious, or this is a critical vulnerability. Oftentimes, components and dependencies embedded within software are at one time safe. It's not until later that new threat intelligence comes out that makes you aware that this widely used open source package like a log4j, right, is susceptible to this kind of critical severity vulnerability that's highly exploitable, like log4 shell. So it's important to capture, once again, completeness of the parts, the components and dependencies which make up every single software package you deploy and consume across all versions, and track that over time. So you have this library that you can data mine on, and then essentially layer threat intelligence on top of that to identify newly emerging risks and threats in these known kind of open source or commercial components which make up your software estate, and then very quickly doing targeted investigation on that. So it's not always the first time that you're going to find it. It's also about building this inventory of components and dependencies, layering that with threat intelligence so that you can make more targeted response efforts.
I mean, obviously the burden of this falls on software producers, their attack, their exposure to compromises within their development pipeline, their CI/CD environment, what have you, is much higher. The risk for them, both reputationally in terms of financially and so on, much higher. And it's a much more complex task. If we go to the next slide, though, I don't think that software consumers also can benefit from threat intel in terms of protecting themselves from software supply chain risks. And three of the things, some of the recommendations that are in the Dummies book on this are to, start orienting yourself to this type of attack. For example, looking for evidence of known vulnerabilities being exploited. We talked about the Ivanti Pulse Secure VPN. Also scanning those binaries that you're receiving from even your trusted software vendors, even very large companies, right? For things that don't seem right or are different from the last version, known good version of a project. So, there's been a change here. It doesn't really correspond to anything I'm seeing in the release notes in terms of features. Should I reach back out to the company and get them to explain what's going on, dig deeper myself? And then, of course, with the advent of SBOMs and software bills of material and more transparency into the ingredients of what you're getting in both your commercial software files, knock on wood that happens. It's happening in the government space, still TBD in a lot of non-public sector environments. But assuming that continues to get adoption, taking a look at that SBOM and assessing the third party, both open source and commercial dependencies that are within that binary, and whether those align with known risks. So known exploitable vulnerabilities, old code and outdated codes, kind of concept of file rot, which is even just being 7 or 8 years old, even if there's not a known 10 criticality CVE, code that old is almost certainly going to have stuff going on with it. Those are the types of things that, again, can inform your activity as a software consumer regarding supply chain risk. Charlie, any thoughts on that?
No, I think you covered it well. I think we'll see. You mentioned SBOM. I think Cyclone DX has been doing a really good job of kind of leading the way of defining what the future of an SBOM looks like to capture additional metadata beyond just components and dependencies of a software package, to include other or I'll say metadata that can be used to glean some interesting intelligence and risk considerations, like networking intelligence that may be found inside a software package, like behaviors that may be found in a software package, like cryptographic materials that may be found in a software package. So I think we'll see the SBOM begin to expand in terms of the type of information that it will capture to allow for more interesting threat hunting activities like what we're talking about now.
Absolutely. And in fact, as we're speaking today, the SBOM-orama is getting going, I think, out in Colorado, or maybe it's tomorrow. I guess, what is today? Oh, no, it's today. Today and tomorrow. SBOM-orama, which CISA hosts, and it's a big kind of confab for people who are passionate about SBOMs to talk about the current state and future. And I think one of the big items on the agenda this SBOM-orama is just what you're talking about, Charlie, operationalizing SBOMs, getting them to a place where it's not just a checkbox like, oh yes, we received the SBOM, compliance, we've complied, but actually, okay, let's take this information and use it to, make our environment more secure. The trend lines again, we here at ReversingLabs do a lot of work scanning open source repositories, and I think the trend lines are all pointing in the same way. Although I will say, I think some of the recent moves by open source repos and package managers to institute things like multi-factor, authentication by demand might bend the curve a little bit on malicious packages, but this is just a playground for malicious actors these days in a way that I think it wasn't 5 or 6 years ago. Yeah, and this is data that supports that. Okay. Yeah, this shows the same thing as npm, pretty popular, obviously very, very popular open source package manager, and this just shows the breakdown of secrets leaks by service, and these were all discovered by ReversingLabs. And as you can tell, not surprisingly, they correspond to kind of what the most popular platforms are: GitHub, AWS, Google, and so on, Slack, npm itself. So these tens of leak secrets tend to reflect, just the population of users and projects. Next slide. Okay, so we're coming up. We got about 8 minutes left, 10 minutes left. First of all, if you got questions, actually there is a question. Go ahead and use the Q&A feature, and Charlie and I'd be happy to get to them before we break. Let's do the tips, and then we can take some of the questions. Okay, Charlie?
Sure.
Okay.
I'm excited about that discussion.
Yeah. So one of the things with Dummies books is they all have the same kind of last chapter, which is 10 tips to kind of help you focus you and send you on your way. And so we've got that in our Dummies book as well. 10 tips on improving, on building a successful software supply chain security program. And why don't we'll just take turns with these. The first one is, first of all, broaden your AppSec program. And this is maybe easier than it sounds, but I think the idea here is you need to really expand your thinking about application security beyond, what our present understanding of it is. Things like SAS, DAS, SCA, code scanning, and looking for, bad coding practices, vulnerabilities, and so on. Your application security program needs to include some of the other things that Charlie talked about that aren't part of the current paradigm. The types of things that SAST program, that an organization that doesn't have access to source code wants to know about from a risk perspective. So that's the number one. Charlie, you want to take number two?
Sure. So securing your development infrastructure. I think this one's interesting to me. I'm going to approach it from a third-party risk perspective, even though it's developer-oriented, of course. I think people often don't consider the variety of tool chains that actually make up a developer infrastructure of a software publisher, from IDEs to source code management platforms to CI/CD tooling. A lot of these are, once again, going to be third-party software solutions, which are also susceptible to the threat that you may be trying to mitigate as a software developer yourself, that they may have malicious code inserted into them, or they may be tampered with or compromised in some way. So once again, it's important not to only have very strong guardrails around not only procuring tools which make up your development infrastructure in a safe manner, but then also kind of security best practices in managing access to those tools, monitoring use of those tools, logging use of those tools, looking for suspicious activity that may demonstrate a build environment compromise has happened. So once again, it's more developer oriented, but understanding the tools that make up that infrastructure and how they're managed and protected is really important to making sure that you don't get compromised at the end of the day. Because once your development infrastructure is compromised, it's very easy to start distributing tainted software to your downstream customers.
Yeah. Number three is beware of file rot, and this is a big one. File rot is just a term that refers to old and outdated software. And I think one of the things we see here at ReversingLabs as we analyze, commercial software packages and for our customers is the prevalence of really outdated modules. I mean, we talked about it in the context of Pulse Secure VPN, and operating system on this device hasn't been updated with security update in 4 years because it's end of life, open source modules that are 10, 15 years old, right? Some of these files go back to the sort of 386 era. Doesn't necessarily mean that they are vulnerable, but what it does mean is that these are, old files that, probably are due to be replaced, but there needs to be, as a development organization, you need to prioritize that. It's a shift in thinking from the if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? So we've been using this file for 10 years and we know our stuff works. If we pull it out, stuff might break. We all get it. We all get it. The question is, what you're not weighing in that equation is the security costs of keeping that old, outdated file in there. And that needs to be actually weighted more heavily so that the scales start to tip. So that's kind of the file rot issue. Charlie.
And then lastly, final package exam. Again, we've talked about this a lot today. It's really just about setting up kind of security stage gates, depending on your role, right, before you ship or before you deploy or procure, to make sure you can really discharge these claims of negligence that actually may be thrown your way, which we're now seeing in becoming actual court claims, by demonstrating we were not aware of any known malware, any known tampering, any critical severity vulnerabilities at the time we either delivered the software to our customers or before we purchased it and procured it and put customer or employee data within it. So once again, kind of a CYA to ensure that you are aware of the risk and that you are comfortable with that risk in its final state, in the state that you're actually going to use it.
Great. Okay, so we got a question from Matthew. These are there are 10 tips, and here are the other 6. So in the meantime, we got a question from Matthew. From a consumer perspective, it can be costly to assess the security posture of all the software we may be using. This cost includes tooling as well as the expertise to evaluate the tool's results. That's the truth. How do you see supply chain security evolving for consumers to address this? How do we encourage suppliers to take more responsibility beyond the questionnaires and other failing models? Charlie.
Great question. We actually touch base on a lot of this in the third-party risk chapter in the book. Firstly, I would say it's no different than how you would manage any other third-party risk or supply chain risk management program, right? You can't oversee all of your third parties. You should deploy or extend your existing kind of. A lot of organizations will have inherent risk models in which they determine who their most critical severity vendors are that they rely on to run their business. So either creating one from new if you don't have that already, or extending it to capture elements that would consider what makes a software supplier risky. So does the software require administrative rights to operate within your environment? Is it connecting to or communicating with your crown jewel systems in some way? Does it have highly sensitive data going into it? Is it deployed across one end user device or desktop within your environment, or every single end user device and desktop or server within your environment? Understanding those characteristics and baking those in to focus on those software vendors which are most critical to your business. So you go from 10,000 down to 10 or 20 or 30, whatever is within your risk appetite, focusing on those. In terms of how do you then kind of delegate responsibility to your vendor, it depends on how mature they are, how willing they are to interact with you. The most successful third-party programs I've seen are those that have really good relationships, open relationships with their vendors. So where you have tools and capabilities to obtain intelligence into the products that you're consuming, share that with your vendors. I would encourage you to do that. Turn your Pato Pet has a really good blog, the CISO of JPMC, about turning their intelligence outward on their supply chain and sharing that with their vendors. I think that is an amazing best practice that everyone should emulate. Sharing that with your vendor and working with them to fix it in alignment with both your risk appetites. So hopefully that answers your question. There's a lot more in the book that talks about it as well.
Okay. And we have one other question from Kay Green. What would be the top 3 tips for small businesses who may have their IT through an MSP? Really good question. You know, when you're outsourcing to service providers. So, I mean, I think one of the benefits of things like SBOMs, right, is to you know, increase the transparency for both cloud and, you know, on-premise software providers. So I would just sort of say, I mean, the things I would say is, you know, perform final, find a way to perform final exams for software, and, push your vendors to provide transparency around the services and software that they're providing to your organization. And then the rest of the stuff kind of flows from that. Saying just trust us, we're a security vendor, so of course our stuff's secure. I think as the Pulse Secure VPN incident shows you, you cannot assume that. And so if they've got sensitive access to your environment, high-level access to your environment, you need to be pushing back and asking them to prove to you that what they're putting out on your environment is secure and safe. Yeah, go ahead, Troy.
I was just going to add another layer of that is if you're using a very large MSP, they may have a lot more buying power in the market to have those conversations with their upstream vendors. So I'd say, I mean, it's a little bit more convoluted because you have a third party that is between you and the software that you're consuming in the MSP, but I think you could use that to your advantage at the end of the day.
Because they are a big buyer. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
But this is a security poverty line, right? This is what we talk about. Small companies don't have the, clout to push back against large software vendors and say, we need this, we need that, you need to show us this and show us that. So yeah, MSPs in some ways can help you with that. Okay, we're over time. Sorry. But keep so we got a lot of resources here at Reversing Labs beyond this amazing Dummies book and the webinar. There is a event coming up on September 25th, Software Supply Chain Security 101, with Jasmine Knoll and Joshua Knox, our very esteemed colleagues. And that's going to be something that you might want to sign up for. And we didn't talk a lot about Spectre Assure, our software supply chain security platform, but if you're interested in learning more about this, you heard a lot about what Spectre can find. We got an event coming up on the 27th that is going to introduce the Spectre Assure supply chain security solution. And if you want to read more, Gartner has a report talking about it's a leader's guide to software supply chain security. Happy to report that Reversing Labs is mentioned positively in that report, and we've got a link to download and read that, so check that out on our website as well. And with that, I think we're going to wrap. Charlie, anything you want to say before we break?
No, just thank you everyone for coming. Download the Dummies book and interact with us. Let us know if you have questions, feedback, like Paul said, complaints. We're always glad to chat on the topic.
Charlie, it's been a pleasure, and we'll have to do this again.
Yes, definitely.
All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you all again soon.